Welcome to Restoria. I'm Arthur, and this is your quiet place for gentle bedtime stories. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let the story slow your thoughts and ease you softly into sleep. Penelope at the Loom. The great house had gone down into sleep, and Penelope rose to meet the hour she kept for herself. She had lain a while in the dark of her chamber, listening until the last of the sounds below had faded. The suitors had stumbled at last to their beds or to the benches in the hall, heavy with wine, their voices guttering out one by one like lamps left to burn down. The maids had banked the fires. The dogs had settled in the courtyard with their noses under their paws. Now the only sound that reached her was the sea, far below the walls, folding itself against the rocks of Ithaca, the way it had folded there since before the house was built, and would fold long after, indifferent and even and never once at rest. She wrapped a robe about her shoulders against the cool of the night, and took up the small clay lamp from the table by her bed. Its flame leaned and steadied as she lifted it. By its light, she crossed the chamber to the inner room where the loom stood, the tall, upright loom of polished wood that had been hers since she came to this house a bride, and where the great web hung waiting for her in the dark. The lamp threw her shadow huge against the wall, and then drew it small again as she set the light down on its bracket, and the room came up gold around her. The loom, the stool, the baskets of wool, the high small window through which a square of stars showed cold and clear. The room had its own smell, and she breathed it in as she always did upon entering, the smell that was hers alone in all the house. Wool, first of all, the warm animal smell of the fleeces heaped in their baskets, oiled and carded and ready for the work. Then the olive oil of the lamp, clean and faintly green. Then the dry smell of the loom itself, the old wood, and under all of it, the salt of the sea that worked its way into every room of every house upon the island, into the cloth and the timber and the very bread. These were the smells of her nights. She had come to love them the way one loves the particular smell of a place where one has been, for a long time, mostly at peace. The web hung from the beam in a broad, pale sheet, taller than a woman, the warp threads running straight down from the top and weighted at their ends with rings of fired clay that held them taut. Across this frame she had been weaving for a long time now. It was a shroud, a burial cloth for Laertes, the father of her husband, an old man who still drew breath up in his orchard on the hill, but who would one day need such a cloth to be laid to rest with honor, as was right, as the custom asked. No one could fault a wife for the weaving of it. No one could ask her to give her hand in marriage again until so sacred a task was finished and the old man's dignity assured. So by day she wove it. In the hall, in the full light, with the maids about her and the suitors looking on, she sat at this loom and sent the shuttle through, and the cloth grew under her hands a little at a time, fine and close and worthy of the man it was meant for. They watched her at it and were satisfied. The work went forward. A wife was keeping faith with the dead to come, and what man could press his suit against so plain a piety? By day the shroud grew. That was what they saw, and they saw truly, and it was only half the truth. There were 3 among the maids she trusted, 3 who had been with her since the early years, and who knew the secret of the nights and kept it. They helped her by day at the carding and the spinning, and by day they said nothing, and their faces gave nothing away to the men who lounged about the hall. The rest she did not tell. A secret shared too wide is a secret no longer, and so the most of the household believed only what their eyes reported, that the lady wove, that the cloth lengthened, that the long work crept toward its end. Only the three knew that the end never came, and that it was not meant to, and they guarded the not coming of it as carefully as if it had been the dearest treasure of the house. In a way, it was, for the other half belonged to the night, and to this hour, and to no eyes but her own. Penelope drew the stool close to the loom and sat, and smoothed her palms once down the length of the hanging cloth, feeling the small ridges of the weft where the day's work lay. Then she found the last thread she had set that afternoon, the topmost row, the newest, and with the tip of one finger she lifted it free of its neighbors. She took it between finger and thumb, and she began, with great care, to draw it back out of the cloth, undoing in the dark what she had done in the light. The thread came loose with a faint, dry whisper, sliding back through the warp, and she wound it as it came onto her hand, looping it round her palm and her thumb, so that nothing was lost or tangled, and every length of wool could be used again tomorrow. This was the work. This was the whole of it. To unmake the day's weaving, row by row, until the cloth stood again where it had stood that morning, no nearer finished than before. In this way, the shroud was forever almost done and never done. In this way, the years had passed, and Odysseus had not come, and she had not been made to choose another, and the loom had held the line of her waiting, like the rocks below held the line of the shore. She was horned for the time of receipts of Hebemis. The journey had taken so Sean's continuing successfully, but a carte reprise had finished the Chohara. She knew the whole journey of it, the shearing, the washing in the streams, the long combing out of the fleece, the spinning on the distaff that turned in her women's hands from dawn to dusk through the winter months. By the time it reached the loom, the wool had passed through 100 patient labors, and she thought sometimes that the cloth held all of them in its threads, the streams and the slopes and the turning spindles, the whole island wound up small and woven into a single sheet of pale, fine work. To unmake it gently, thread by thread, felt less like ruin than like setting all of that free again to be remade. She had stopped hearing it through the days, the way one stops hearing a thing that never ceases, but in the hush of the night it came back to her, low and steady, rising up the cliff and in at the high window. It was the same water that lay between her and her husband, wherever he was upon it, or beyond it. She did not let herself follow that thought far. The sea was simply the sea. It carried ships and it sank them. It brought men home and it kept them. And it asked nothing and promised nothing. And there was a strange comfort in a thing so wholly without mercy and without malice, that did only what it was and nothing more. Her fingers found the next thread and drew it back. The motion had become a thing her hands knew without her watching them. The lift, the pinch, the long, even pull, the winding round the palm. She could have done it with her eyes closed, and on some nights she nearly did, her gaze drifting to the square of stars while her hands kept on at the cloth below. There was no haste in it. A row undone, and then another, the pale sheet giving back its threads to her one by one, the the work of hours coming apart in a fraction of the time it had taken to make, as all made things come apart faster than they are built. Under her hands, the cloth had a life of its own. Where the weft lay close, it was smooth as the inside of a shell, and where a new row waited, it stood a little proud, a ridge her fingertip could find in the dark. She read the day's work that way, by touch, the long bands of plain weave and the raised lines of the borders, the whole of it a kind of writing that only her hands could understand. The threads were cool at the top, where the night air reached them, and held a faint trace of the day's heat lower down, near the beam. She let her palm rest flat against them for a moment before she began, feeling the give and the tension, the loom breathing under her touch like a creature half asleep. The shuttle lay where she had set it down at dusk, on the sill of the high window, its smooth boat of olive wood wound with the weft she would use again tomorrow. She did not need it for this work. The unmaking asked no shuttle, only her fingers, and so the little tool rested through the night while she labored, the one part of the loom allowed to sleep. Beside it lay the bone pin she used to lift a stubborn thread, and the small knife she rarely needed, and the comb of polished wood for beating the rows home. Her tools. She knew the weight and grain of each of them, as she knew her own fingers, and at night they kept her company on the sill, a row of faithful things waiting with her for the dawn. As the rows came free, the clay weights along the bottom of the warp shifted and turned, knocking softly one against another, a small dull music of fired earth that she had grown to love. It was the loom's own voice, low and patient, speaking only at night when the hall below had gone silent. By day she could not hear it for the noise of the men, the talk and the laughter and the dice. But here, now, with the house asleep, the weights murmured to her as she worked, a sound like distant goats on a far hillside, like pebbles turned over by a slow wave, and she answered it with the rhythm of her hands, the two of them keeping the long night between them, the woman and the wood. The house spoke around her as she worked, in the small voices old houses keep for the night. A timber easing somewhere overhead, a beam letting go the weight of the day, the settle of ash in a banked hearth 2 rooms off. Down in the courtyard, one of the dogs rose, turned 3 times on the stones, and lay back down with a heavy sigh she could hear through the floor. These were friendly sounds, the sounds of a house keeping its people through the dark, and she wove and unwove inside them, as a bird sits its nest inside the noise of a wood, hearing all of it, troubled by none of it, held by the very thing she had long since stopped noticing. The lamp burned at her shoulder with a small, steady flame, and the oil in it gave off the clean smell of the olive, the same smell that hung over the whole island in the pressing season, the smell of the groves that climbed the hills behind the town. Laertes was among those groves even now, asleep in his plain hut, the old king who had given up the house to live among his trees. She thought of him kindly. He grafted his own stock and pruned his own branches and slept on a bed of leaves by his own fire, and he asked for nothing from the world below but to be let alone with his orchard. One day she would carry this cloth up the hill to him, finished at last, but not yet, not while the finishing meant the end of her waiting. Odysseus had walked those same groves as a boy, learning the trees at his father's side. The old man had given him saplings of his own, a count of them, pears and figs and rows of vines, and the boy had known each one by name and tended them and watch them come into fruit. It was a thing the two men shared that no war and no sea could take from them: the knowledge of growing things, the patience of the orchard, where nothing can be hurried and everything comes in its season, or not at all. She liked to think that wherever he was, that patience was in him still, that the boy who had learned to wait for figs had grown into a man who knew how to wait for a shore, as she had learned to wait for him. She wound a full hank of the reclaimed wool and laid it in the basket at her feet, and took up the loose end again, and went on. The cloth had shortened by a hand's breadth now, the topmost rows gone back into thread, and the pattern she had set in the day stood interrupted, half a figure, half a border, waiting to be remade tomorrow exactly as before. She knew the pattern by feel. She had woven it and unwoven it so many times that her fingers carried it the way a singer carries a song long after the meaning of the words has worn smooth, the doing of it more familiar to her now than her own face in the bronze. The borders she set were always of growing or moving things, vines that climbed and curled along the edge of the cloth, waves that ran in rows, crest after crest, the way the real sea ran below, ships sometimes, small and dark, their sails set, making for a harbour she never quite wove in, leaving them always at sea, always on their way. Leaving his belost saying home jejed after Sintolana. She did not weave still things, walls or towers or seated figures. She wove only what travelled, what reached, what was on its way toward something, as though by filling the cloth with journeys she might call one particular journey home. And then by night she undid them all, the vines and the waves and the small brave ships, and set them free to be woven again tomorrow, still travelling, still not yet arrived. In the corner of the room, on a low couch, Eurynome slept. The old nurse would not let her keep these hours alone, and so she came each night and lay down in the dark of the inner room and slept there while her mistress worked, a known shape breathing in the corner, asking nothing, keeping her company in the only way that was left. Penelope was glad of her, not for help, for there was nothing to help with, only for the warmth of another life in the room, the small sound of another breath beneath the larger sound of the sea. Some part of the long waiting was made lighter only by not being born entirely alone. Somewhere across the house her son was sleeping too. Telemachus, who had been a babe at her breast when his father sailed and was now near grown, a young man with his father's set to his shoulders and his father's way of going quiet when he was thinking. The office she had raised him in the middle of the long waiting, had watched him take his first steps across the same floors his father had crossed, had answered as best she could the questions a boy asks about a man he cannot remember. He was the one thread of Odysseus that had stayed in the house, growing where the man could not, and she had tended him as Laertes tended his trees, patiently, without hurry, trusting the season to do its work. He was nearly come to fruit now. That was its own kind of comfort and its own kind of ache, and she held the two together and did not try to part them. The threads came back, and the basket filled. Penelope let her thoughts loosen and wander as her hands kept their work. She thought of the loom itself, of the wood of it, smoothed by her own palms over so many years that it had taken a shine like water. Odysseus had a fondness for things well made, for joints that fit and beams that held, for the honest work of the hand. He had built their marriage bed with his own tools, carved from the standing trunk of an olive tree that grew up through the floor of their chamber, rooted in the earth below the house, so that the bed could never be moved, was fixed and growing and alive at its root. No one knew the secret of that bed but the two of them. It was a thing between them that the years could not touch, down there in the dark of the rooted wood, waiting as she waited. She remembered the morning he had gone, though she kept the memory folded small and took it out only rarely. The harbour crowded with the black ships, the men loading them, the oars run out, the sails lying ready. He had stood with her at the last on the stones above the water, the baby in her arms between them, and he had said little, for he was not a man for many words at such a moment. He had laid his hand on the child's head. He had looked at her in the way that said more than speaking, and then he had gone down to the ships, and the oars had taken them out past the headland, and she had watched the sails until they were less than gulls, less than specks, less than nothing on the bright line of the sea. She had not wept then. She had saved that for later, for the nights in the early years when there were still tears in her for the saving. A gust came up off the water and leaned the flame, and her shadow swayed on the wall and righted itself. The stars in the high window had wheeled a little, the square of them turned by some small degree as the night went round. She marked the turning without counting it. Time in this room was not the time of the hall below, the time of meals and councils and the long press of the suitors at her gate. It was an older time, the time of the sea and the stars, that did not hurry and could not be hurried, that asked only that a thing be done and then undone and then done again, the way the tide came up the rock and drew back and came again, neither gaining nor losing, holding its line. She had wept in the early years. She would not pretend otherwise to herself, here in the honest dark where there was no one to perform her courage for. There had been nights when the threads blurred before her and her hands shook at the work, when the waiting had felt like a weight laid on her chest that she could not lift or set down. But that had eased as all things ease. The grief had not gone, but it had found its place in her, the way a stone dropped into deep water finds the bottom at last and settles there and stirs no more. She had made a kind of peace with the not knowing. She carried it now the way she carried the lamp, lightly, by long custom, hardly feeling its weight. She was not the only woman on the island who waited. Up and down the rocky coast, in the houses of the town and the farms on the hills, other wives kept their own vigils for men who had sailed to the same war and not yet found their way back from it. Some had given up and remarried. Some wore mourning. Some, like her, held to a hope they could not have defended to a stranger, a hope worn thin and grey with the years, but not yet worn through. She felt them sometimes, all those other waiting women, scattered through the dark island around her, each at her own hearth, each holding her own thread across the sea, and she did not feel alone among them, but rather one of a great quiet company, a sisterhood of the patient, keeping their lamps lit against a long night none of them had chosen. The work was its own comfort in this. There was a mercy in a task that asked the hands and freed the mind, that gave the long hours a shape and a rhythm to lean on. Lift and pinch and draw and wind. The thread came back, the cloth grew shorter, the basket grew full. On nights when her thoughts ran toward the harbour and the ships that never carried him, she had only to bend closer to the threads and let the rhythm take her, and after a while the harbour would loosen its hold and there would be only the wool again, the dry whisper of it, the small repeated motion, the work. The sea below rose and fell. She listened to it between the rows, the long draw of the water up the shingle and the longer draw of it back, and she found, as she always found in the end, that her breath had fallen into time with it. In on the rise, out on the fall. The whole island seemed to breathe that way around her. The sleeping town, the dark groves on the hills, the old man among his trees, the household below, all of them rising and falling on the one long breath of the sea, and she at the loom in the middle of it, breathing too, undoing her small bright cloth by the light of one flame. More than anything, it was the sea that kept her through these hours. It had been there every night of all the years, the one voice that never failed her, never wearied, never asked a thing. When the house was full of the suitors and their wanting, she could not hear it. When the day was loud with the work of the hall, it was lost beneath the rest. But here, now, in the deep of the night, it rose to her clear and even off the rocks, the long fall and draw of it, and she leaned on the sound the way a tired traveler leans on a wall, letting it bear a little of her weight. The sea did not know her name. It would have sounded the same had she never been born, and yet she felt befriended by it, accompanied, the less alone for its long, even company. She said a few words then, under her breath, to the grey-eyed goddess who had always favoured her husband. Not a plea, for she had worn out pleading long ago. Only a few plain words, the kind one says to an old friend in passing, asking nothing, telling nothing, simply marking that the bond was there and unbroken. Keep him if he lives, bring him if he can come, and if neither, then give me the strength for one more night's work and one more after that. She did not know if the goddess heard. It did not greatly matter. The saying of the words settled her, the way a familiar prayer will, whether or not any ear receives it, and she bent again to the threads with her hands the steadier for having spoken. The figure in the cloth came apart under her fingers. It had been a deer, or the beginning of one, a deer standing in a thicket with its head lifted, the kind of thing she set into the borders to keep her hand interested through the long days of weaving. Now its raised head went back into thread, and then its slender neck, and then the line of its back, until there was only the thicket left, and then not even that. She felt no sorrow at the unmaking. The deer would stand again tomorrow. It always stood again. There was a freedom in making a thing you knew you would unmake, a lightness the day weavers never knew, who had to live with every fault set permanent in the cloth. Hers was a weaving without consequence, endlessly forgiven, endlessly begun. Uranimes stirred in the corner and murmured something out of her sleep and went quiet again. Penelope glanced toward her and smiled in the dark. The old woman had nursed Odysseus when he was a boy, had carried him on her hip about these same halls, and now she lay guarding the nights of the wife he had left behind, the last living thread that joined this room to the child he had been. So many of the threads that had bound the house together had been drawn out over the years, the friends gone, the parents dead, the boy Telemachus grown almost to a man before her eyes. But some held yet, some held. There was a bronze mirror somewhere in her chamber, in a chest where it had lain unused for longer than she could say. In the early years, she had looked in it often. Now she scarcely thought of it. What was a face to her, with no one she wished to be seen by, no one whose eye she cared to catch across a room? She had let her looks go their own way and felt no loss in it. The vanity of the girl who had come to this house a bride had been set aside like a robe outgrown, and what had come in its place was something she would not have traded back, a self that did not need a mirror to know its own worth, that found its measure not in any face, but in the long, faithful labor of these hands, she came to the end of a long row and paused to flex her fingers, which had grown stiff with the fine, repeated work. She turned her hands over in the lamplight and looked at them. They were not the hands she had brought to this house. The girl's hands were gone, and in their place were these, the knuckles a little broadened, the skin a little roughened at the fingertips from the endless passage of the wool, the hands of a woman who had done a great work patiently for a great while. She did not grieve the change. These were better hands. They had learned something the girl's hands never knew, the long discipline of waiting, the strength that is not loud, the kind of holding on that looks from the outside like simply sitting at a loom. The basket at her feet was near full now, the reclaimed wool coiled in it in pale, loose hanks, ready to be wound into balls before the dawn and carried back to its place, so that no maid coming in the morning would find the cloth shorter than she had left it. That was the care of the thing, the part that asked the most of her. Not the unweaving, which her hands could do half asleep, but the covering of the unweaving, the leaving of no trace. Each night the room had to be put back exactly as the day had left it, the wool restored, the threads hidden, the cloth hung as though it had only grown and never shrunk. Each morning she had to walk down into the hall and take up the shuttle and weave again over ground she had already won and lost 100 times. Each morning she had to walk down into the hall so she could stick sterling raw ease low, battling across craft she believed. It might have broken another woman, that sameness, that labor with no visible end. It had not broken her. She had found, somewhere in the long middle of the years, that the sameness was not a prison, but a kind of shelter. The days did not pile up on her with their grief, because each day undid itself before the next began. She lived, in a way, in a single long day that renewed itself forever, weaving and unweaving, the cloth never finished, and so the waiting never lost, the story held open at the one page she could bear, the page where he was on his way home. She thought, as she often did at this hour, of all the cloth that had ever been made in the world, and worn and washed, and mended and worn again until it was soft as a breath, and then at last laid by. Cloth outlived the hands that made it. The shroud she wove and unwove would one day be real, would be finished by some other set of hands if not her own, and would wrap the old man up the hill and go into the earth with him as his last soft kindness against the cold ground. There was no sorrow in the thought tonight. The all things were woven and unwoven. The years themselves were a kind of weaving, the days going through like the weft, over and under, light and shade, building a pattern too large for any one pair of eyes to see the whole of. She was content to be a thread in it, and to do her part, and to wait. The lamp had begun to gutter, the oil in it run low, and she took up the small jug she kept by the loom and tipped a thin stream into the bowl until the flame drew up bright again. The fresh oil caught, and the room brightened, the threads leaping back into gold relief, the shadows drawing into the corners. She trimmed the wick with her fingers, pinching off the blackened end, and the light steadied to a clear, even burn. This, too, was part of the night, the tending of the flame, the keeping of the one light by which the secret work was done. Let the lamp go out, and the night's labor would have to wait in the dark. So she fed it and watched it and kept it, the way she kept everything that had been given into her hands to keep. The lamp burned full again, and its light had gone deep and gold, throwing the threads into soft relief. She bent again to the work. The cloth was much shorter now. The day's weaving nearly all returned to thread, and she slowed her hands as she neared the end, drawing out the last rows with extra care, for the closer she came to the morning's starting place, the more it mattered that nothing be pulled awry. Lift and pinch and draw and wind. The deer was long gone. The border was gone. What hung before her now was the plain ground of the shroud, even and unmarked, exactly as it had hung when the first light came into the hall that morning and she had taken up her place before it. She wound the last reclaimed thread onto her hand and tucked its end safely under, and the day's weaving was wholly undone. The cloth hung quiet in the lamplight, neither longer nor shorter than it had been a day ago, a year ago. The same broad, pale sheet waiting on the same beam. Penelope sat back on the stool and let her hands come to rest in her lap. It was finished, the night's labor, the unmaking complete. There remained only the winding of the wool, and that she would do soon, when she had rested a moment, when she had let the quiet of the done work settle over her. The sea came up at the window, even and low. The stars had wheeled on across their square. In the corner, Eurynome breathed her old, slow breath. Penelope sat among these things and felt the peace that came to her only here, only at this hour, the peace of a task carried faithfully through to its nightly close. No one would ever praise her for this work. No one would ever see it, this great patient labor of the dark, this weaving that left nothing behind. And yet it was the truest thing she did, truer than the cloth they admired in the hall, for the cloth was only the seaming of the work, and this was the work itself, the keeping of faith, done over and over, where no eye could find it. She thought of Odysseus, lightly now, without the old ache. Somewhere under these same stars he might be sitting as she sat, in some hall or on some shore, looking up at the wheeling lights and thinking of Ithaca, of the house above the sea, of her. She let the thought be a gentle one. She did not bend it toward grief or toward hope, but let it rest where it was, a man and a woman under the one sky, divided by the sea and joined by it, each holding to the other across the dark water by a thread no one else could see, a thread that did not break for all the years drawn out along its length. The wool waited in the basket. After a while, she leaned and took up the first loose hank and began to wind it into a ball, round and round over her fingers, the pale wool gathering into a smooth shape in her palm. This was the last task and the easiest, the one her hands liked best, the long winding that asked nothing but to be done. One ball grew full, and she set it in the second basket and took up the next hank. The lamp burned lower. The sea drew up the rock and drew back. Round and round the wool went over her fingers, gathering, smoothing, growing into its quiet shape. Far off, from somewhere down toward the town, a single bird tried its voice and fell quiet again, the first of them, testing whether the morning was near enough to sing for. For this particular sawmill rainbird, she said, it was not yet. The bird thought better of it and held its peace, and the night closed back over the small sound, and there was only the sea again, and the murmur of the clay weights and the turning of the wall. But the bird had marked the hour for her. The deepest part of the night was passing. The dark had reached its floor and would soon begin, by the smallest of measures, to lift. She wound a little faster to be done before the light. Her eyes had grown heavy with the lateness and the steady work. She did not fight it. The winding could be done half asleep, and half asleep she did it, her fingers turning the wool by themselves, while her gaze rested unfocused on the middle distance, on the gold air above the lamp, on nothing at all. The room had grown very quiet around her. The stars in the window had begun to pale, though the dawn was a good way off, only the first thinning of the deep night, the hour when the world holds its breath at the bottom of the dark before it turns again toward the light. One by one, the hanks became balls, and the first basket emptied as the second filled. Penelope wound the wool and listened to the sea and felt the long night settle toward its close. One never. Tomorrow she would weave again. She would walk down into the hall in the morning light and take up the shuttle and set the deer once more into the border, and the suitors would watch her, and the cloth would grow, and they would be satisfied. And tomorrow night she would climb again to this room and undo it all once more, as she had tonight, as she would the night after. There was no end she could see to it. There was only the doing, and the doing was enough, and she had made it enough. The last hank lay across her fingers. She wound it down to nothing, to the final length, and tucked the end beneath the others, and set the finished ball with its fellows in the basket. The wool was all restored. The cloth hung whole and waiting on its beam. The room was as the day had left it, every trace of the night's unmaking smoothed away, the secret kept for one more turning of the dark. She did not rise yet. She sat on the stool with her hands at rest in her lap and let the quiet hold her. The lamp had sunk low again, its flame grown small and blue at the root, the last of the fresh oil drawing up the wick. By its failing light, the loom stood tall and patient in the room, the pale cloth upon it, the baskets of wool below. All was as it should be. All was ready for the morning that would ask the same of her again, and that she would give again as she had always given. The sea folded against the rocks below the walls. In the corner, the old nurse slept on. The square of stars had gone the color of ash, paling toward the gray that comes before the first true light. Penelope sat among the sleeping things of her house and was at peace, the night's faith kept, the loom at rest, the long task carried once more to its quiet close. The flame of the lamp drew down. It wavered and stood and wavered again, the small gold point of it sinking into the clay. Her hands lay open and at rest in her lap, the wool all wound, the work all done. The sea went on below, rising and falling, the one long breath beneath the world. And the lamp burned to its last and dimmed, and the gold faded gently from the walls, and the room settled into the grey hush of the hour before the dawn, the cloth hanging whole upon the loom, waiting as it had always waited, as it would wait again.